bought a rejected K9 German Shepherd at an auction. What happened next moved everyone. The auctioneer's voice echoed through the room. Too soft. Lacks aggression. No one wanted the K9 reject standing under the lights. Until Khalil Al-Mansour raised his hand. A billionaire buying a failed dog? It made no sense. But what happened after that left everyone speechless. Before we continue, subscribe to the channel, like this video, and turn on notifications. This is a story you won't forget. The auction hall buzzed with hushed conversations, the air thick with the scent of polished leather and expensive cologne. Under the blinding stage lights, elite K9 German Shepherds paraded one by one, their muscular frames and intense gazes promising strength and obedience. Each bid climbed higher as buyers fought to claim the most formidable protection dogs. Khalil Al-Mansour sat in the front row, his sharp eyes scanning the animals with disinterest. A billionaire with an empire built on precision and control. He wasn't there for sentimentality. He wanted an elite guardian, a living fortress to guard his estate. To him, loyalty had a price, and he was willing to pay it. Then, a shift in the atmosphere. The auctioneer cleared his throat, a flicker of hesitation in his voice. Ladies and gentlemen, next up, Lot 27, Max. A German Shepherd was led onto the stage. His black and tan coat gleamed under the harsh lights, his eyes deep and observant. Unlike the others, Max didn't stand tall and menacing. He wasn't tense with aggression. Instead, he sat calmly, ears perked, watching the crowd with quiet intelligence. The auctioneer continued. Removed from the K9 program, lacks necessary aggression for police or military work. Too soft for the field. His voice carried a hint of dismissal. Starting bid, $5,000. Silence. Khalil watched as men in suits exchanged skeptical glances. A failed K9 had no value. These dogs were bred for dominance, trained to attack on command. A dog without aggression was nothing more than a pet, and pets were of no interest to men like them. The handler tugged Max's leash, prompting him to stand. But the dog didn't react with defiance or submission. He simply looked up, his dark eyes locked onto the handler's face, waiting, patient, steady, as if he understood exactly what was happening. 5,000, the auctioneer repeated, scanning the crowd. No hands went up. Khalil should have ignored it. The dog was useless to him. But there was something in Max's gaze, something unsettlingly different. Not fear, not defiance, just understanding. Almost without thinking, he raised his hand. 10,000. The room stirred with murmurs. A billionaire bidding on a rejected K9? It was an absurdity. 10,000. Going once? Going twice? Sold to Mr. Al-Mansour. The auctioneer's gavel struck the podium, and just like that, the deal was sealed. As Khalil stood, his security detail exchanged confused glances, but no one questioned his decisions. He approached the handler, who handed him Max's leash with a shrug. Good luck, the man muttered. He's a lost cause. Max looked up at Khalil, unblinking. He made no move to resist, no sign of anxiety or excitement, just calm observation, as if assessing the man who had just bought him. Khalil exhaled, gripping the leash tighter. Let's see about that, he murmured, leading the team toward the exit. Outside, the evening air was crisp, the hum of traffic distant, as Khalil walked toward his car. Max moved beside him, in perfect sync, not pulling, not hesitating. There was no need for commands. He simply understood. One of Khalil's men hesitated before speaking. Sir, what do you want us to do with the dog? Khalil glanced down at Max, who met his gaze steadily. He had no real answer. Take him to the estate, he said finally. As the car door opened, Max jumped in without being told. He settled into the seat, resting his head on his paws, eyes half-lidded yet still alert. Khalil watched him for a moment before stepping inside, the door shutting with a soft click. As the car pulled away, he leaned back, staring out at the city lights. He had bought the dog on a whim, but for the first time in years, something about a decision he made felt different. Little did he know, this canine reject was about to change his life in ways he could never have imagined. A flash of movement, a blur of muscle and instinct. Max lunged, not to maul, but to intercept. His powerful body collided with the intruder, knocking him off balance just as Malik stormed in, gun raised. "Don't move!" Malik's voice cut through the tension, his finger steady on the trigger. The intruder hit the ground hard, breath knocked from his lungs. Max stood over him, his chest rising and falling with controlled breaths, eyes locked onto his target. He hadn't bitten, hadn't drawn blood, but the warning was there. If the man made a single wrong move, Max would be on him in an instant. Khalil stepped forward, his expression unreadable as he looked between the mug and the intruder. A dog unfit for service. A dog labeled as too soft. And yet, tonight, that same dog had done something that no security system, no guard, no weapon had done. He had sensed danger before anyone else. He had acted on instinct, without hesitation. Khalil exhaled, a slow breath, his mind shifting in ways he didn't fully understand yet. Max wasn't a mistake. He was a warning Khalil hadn't been wise enough to see coming. And for the first time in years, Khalil realized something unsettling. Perhaps for the first time in his life, he owed someone a debt. A debt to a dog no one else had wanted. The tension in the room was suffocating. The intruder lay on the polished floor, his chest rising and falling in uneven gasps as Malik kept his gun trained on him. But Khalil's focus wasn't on the man, it was on Max. The so-called rejected canine stood firm, his body still, his breathing controlled. Not a single part of him twitched in uncertainty. He had done exactly what he was trained to do: identify a threat, neutralize it, and wait for further commands. Yet, according to the K9's program, he was too soft. Khalil took a slow step forward, his expensive shoes clicking against the marble. Max remained in position, not reacting, but Khalil saw it, the sharp intelligence behind those dark eyes. Max knew he had done something significant. He was waiting. Malik broke the silence first. "Orders, sir?" His voice was steady, but Khalil could hear the edge in it. His chief of security had been by his side for years, had handled threats before, but never like this. Khalil glanced down at the man on the floor. A thief. Likely an amateur, someone desperate enough to break into a billionaire's estate without proper planning. The shattered window was proof that he had no real strategy. If it weren't for Max, Khalil would have never known the man had even entered his home. He turned back to Malik. "Call the police. Have him removed." Malik nodded and pulled out his phone. The moment the intruder realized what was happening, he started to squirm, his breath coming in frantic bursts. "Wait, please, listen, I didn't mean..." Max let out a low growl, and the man froze, his body stiffening instantly. Khalil studied the scene, a part of him expected to feel anger, maybe even a hint of satisfaction that the security of his estate had worked. But this wasn't the result of human preparation. His highly trained guards, his advanced security systems, the impenetrable walls surrounding his property, they had all failed. And yet, a single dog had seen the threat before anyone else. Khalil exhaled through his nose, then shifted his gaze to Max. The dog's ears twitched slightly at the attention, but he didn't break eye contact with the intruder. His discipline was impressive, perhaps even too impressive for a dog that had supposedly failed his training. The police arrived minutes later. Uniformed officers swept in, cuffing the intruder and dragging him out without much resistance. As they left, Malik stayed behind, arms crossed, watching Khalil expectantly. You knew, Khalil murmured, finally turning to his security chief. Malik's brow furrowed. Sir? You knew there was something different about him. Khalil nodded toward Max. Back at the entrance. When he reacted. Malik hesitated. I've worked with trained canines before, he admitted. Max, he's not normal. A bitter chuckle escaped Khalil. That's what the K9 program said too. Too soft. Malik frowned. No, sir. Not soft. Different. That word stuck in Khalil's mind. Different. Khalil glanced down at Max, who was finally relaxing, his body no longer tense, his tail flicking slightly as if waiting for what came next. He wasn't expecting praise. He hadn't been conditioned for it. But there was something else in his posture. Something Khalil couldn't quite place. Loyalty. Not the kind that came from discipline or fear, but something deeper. Max had no reason to protect him. No training had bound him to this estate, to this house, to Khalil himself. Yet, when the moment came, he had acted. And that unsettled Khalil more than he wanted to admit. Without another word, he turned on his heel and walked toward the study, the broken glass crunching under his feet. He would need to have it replaced. Behind him, he heard Malik click his tongue, followed by the soft tap, tap, tap of paws against the marble floor. Max was following him. Khalil stopped. So did Max. A pause, then a sigh. Khalil ran a hand through his dark hair and turned slightly. You're not going to leave me alone, are you? Max simply stared, his eyes unwavering. Khalil exhaled, shaking his head, then motioned toward the hallway. Fine. Do what you want. He expected Max to hesitate, maybe look to Malik for approval. Instead, the dog padded forward and fell into step beside him. Not too close, not too far. The perfect distance. As if he had already figured out how to move in sync with Khalil. And for reasons he couldn't quite explain, Khalil didn't tell him to stop. The next morning, Khalil sat in his sunlit office, his fingers gliding over the polished surface of his mahogany desk. The events of the previous night still played in his mind. The shattered window, the trespasser, and Max's instinctive response. He had spent years surrounding himself with the best security money could buy, yet none of it had detected the intruder before Max had. He leaned back in his chair, gazing out the massive glass window that overlooked his estate. Below, the manicured gardens stretched toward the horizon, a place of order and control. And in the middle of that controlled perfection, pacing along the stone pathways, was him. Max. Khalil watched as the German Shepherd moved with careful purpose, ears alert, gaze scanning his surroundings. He wasn't just wall wandering, he was patrolling, as if this was his home now. A sharp knock at the door pulled Khalil from his thoughts. Malik entered, his posture as disciplined as ever. The glass has been replaced, he reported. Security footage was reviewed. The intruder wasn't armed, just an opportunist. But I've doubled surveillance measures in case he wasn't acting alone. Khalil nodded absent-mindedly, his eyes drifting back to the window. And the dog? Malik hesitated, following his gaze. He hasn't left the grounds since last night. Doesn't seem restless, just watching. Khalil exhaled through his nose. I need to know why he was rejected. Malik raised an eyebrow. The auction report listed the reason, lack of aggression. You think there's more? Khalil stood, adjusting the cuff of his tailored shirt. I don't believe in wasted investments, Malik. That dog isn't weak. He sensed something before we did. He acted without hesitation. That is not the behavior of a failure. Malik nodded slightly. I can look into his training records. No, Khalil said, grabbing his car keys. I'll do it myself. The K9 training facility was an hour outside the city, a stark contrast to Khalil's world of wealth and opulence. Here, Functionality overruled aesthetics. Chain link fences, training fields, and concrete buildings formed the landscape. When Khalil stepped into the office, the man behind the desk barely looked up. He was middle-aged, rough around the edges, the kind of man who had spent a lifetime working with dogs, not people. Khalil placed Max's adoption papers on the counter. "I bought this dog at auction. I want access to his training files." The man finally looked up, eyes narrowing. "Max? The reject?" Khalil's jaw tightened at the dismissive tone. "Yes, the reject who stopped an intruder in my home last night before my security team did." That got the man's attention. He let out a low whistle, then stood, rifling through a filing cabinet. A moment later, he dropped a thick folder onto the desk. "Max was one of our best trainees," the man admitted. "Fast, smart, outperformed others in almost every aspect." Khalil frowned. Then why was he rejected? The man sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "Look, K9 dogs are supposed to be tools, not thinkers. When they're given an order, they follow it. No hesitation, no second guessing. Max wasn't like that." Khalil's eyes narrowed. "Explain." The man flipped open the file, pointing to a section of notes. Max was tested in controlled aggression scenarios, attack drills, suspect takedowns. He executed them all perfectly, except for one problem. He turned the page, revealing a report stamped with a red mark, disqualified due to inconsistent response in high-pressure situations. Khalil read further. Max had been given an order to take down a suspect in a staged test. But in the final moment, when all other dogs would have attacked without hesitation, Max had paused. He had evaluated. Instead of attacking the instructor playing the suspect, he had stopped and waited, as if making his own decision about whether the man was truly a threat. "Dogs don't hesitate," the man continued. "Handlers can't afford that in the field. If a K9 questions an order even once, it could mean life or death. Max wasn't aggressive enough, not because he was weak, but because he was selective." Khalil's fingers traced the report, his mind processing what this meant. Max wasn't unfit. He was thinking. A dog that calculated risks. A dog that acted on instinct, not blind obedience. Khalil closed the folder, something shifting inside him. "You made a mistake rejecting him." The man shrugged. "Maybe, but you own him now, so that's your problem." Khalil smirked faintly. "It's not a problem. It's an advantage." Without another word, he took the file and walked out. As he stepped outside, the cool wind carried the faint scent of grass and distant barking. He reached his car and found Max sitting by the passenger side, waiting for him as if he knew Khalil would return with answers. Khalil opened the door. "Come on, Max." The German Shepherd jumped in effortlessly, settling into his seat with the quiet confidence of an animal that understood he wasn't just a pet. He was chosen. The drive back to the estate was quiet, the hum of the engine filling the space between Khalil and Max. Khalil's fingers drummed against the steering wheel as his mind replayed everything he had just learned. A K9 that thought for itself. A dog that chose whether or not to follow an order. That kind of intelligence wasn't a weakness. It was something far more valuable. Khalil had spent his life building an empire based on control. Every business decision, every partnership, every move he made was calculated. Yet here he was, sitting next to a dog who had defied the very training meant to shape him into a mindless tool. He glanced at Max. The German Shepherd was watching the road ahead, his ears flicking slightly at passing sounds. His body was relaxed, but still alert. He wasn't just sitting, he was observing. "You don't just follow orders, huh?" Khalil muttered, half to himself. Max didn't react, but there was something in his posture that almost felt like a response. When they pulled up to the estate, Malik was waiting at the entrance. He took one look at the folder in Khalil's hand and raised an eyebrow. Find what you were looking for. Khalil stepped out of the car, closing the door behind him as Max jumped out gracefully. More than I expected. Malik's gaze flickered to Max. And? Khalil handed him the folder. Read for yourself. Malik flipped through the pages, his expression unreadable as he scanned the three boards. So he wasn't soft. He was selective. Exactly. Khalil's voice carried an edge of satisfaction. And that makes him more valuable than any other canine they trained. Malik let out a slow breath, closing the folder. You're keeping him then. Khalil didn't answer right away. Instead, he looked at Max, who had stopped just a few steps away, his head tilted slightly as if sensing the conversation was about him. Finally, Khalil exhaled, a smirk ghosting over his lips. He stays. Malik gave a small nod of approval. Then you should start bonding with him properly. A dog like Mopsant isn't just going to accept you as his handler overnight. Khalil shot him a dry look. I don't need to be his handler. No, Malik admitted, but you need to be his partner. Khalil frowned slightly at the word. Partner. He didn't do partners. He had employees, associates, people who answered to him. The idea of considering a dog as an equal in any capacity felt foreign. But then again, Max wasn't just a dog. Khalil sighed. Fine. What do I do? Malik smirked slightly. Start with something simple. Take him for a walk. Khalil rolled his eyes. I'm not a dog walker. You want him to trust you? Malik folded his arms. You have to earn it. Khalil muttered a curse under his breath, but ultimately took the leash Malik handed him. Max's ears perked up slightly, as if recognizing the shift in dynamic. Khalil didn't miss the way the dog's posture straightened, his eyes locking onto his with quiet curiosity. They walked through the vast estate, the evening air cooling as the sun dipped toward the horizon. Khalil had expected the walk to feel awkward, but Max's presence was steady, his movements smooth and controlled. For the first few minutes, Khalil said nothing. He wasn't used to idle conversation, much less with an animal, but the silence felt less like a void and more like an understanding. Eventually, he exhaled. You didn't hesitate last night, he murmured. You knew something was wrong before anyone else did. Max didn't respond, obviously, but his ears twitched as if he was listening. Khalil glanced at him. They called you a failure for thinking on your own, but I see now. That's exactly what makes you dangerous. Max turned his head slightly, meeting his gaze for a brief moment before looking ahead again. It was strange. Khalil had been around dogs before, but none had ever felt this aware. They continued walking, the estate stretching wide around them. For the first time in years, Khalil felt something unexpected, something that unsettled him almost as much as it intrigued him. He wasn't alone. By the time they returned to the house, Malik was waiting by the entrance again, arms crossed. Well? Khalil exhaled, unhooking Max's leash. It was a walk, Malik, not a revelation. Malik smirked, knowingly. Sure. Max shook out his fur, then, without being commanded, sat down beside Khalil's feet, his posture relaxed but deliberate. Malik's smirk grew. Seems like he made up his mind about you. Khalil glanced down at Max. The dog didn't look away. He had chosen to stay close. Chosen. For the first time in a long time, Khalil felt the weight of that word. He had spent his entire life controlling everything around him. But Max? Max had chosen him. That night, Khalil sat in his private lounge, a glass of whiskey in hand. The room was dimly lit, the soft glow of city lights filtering through the massive windows. Outside, Max lay near the glass doors that led to the balcony, his body relaxed, but his ears twitching at the faintest of sounds. Khalil found himself watching the dog more than he cared to admit. It was strange. He had spent years surrounded by the most ruthless men in business, men who would sell their own families for power. He had built an empire based on calculated risks, yet here he was, unable to stop analyzing a single dog. With a sigh, he leaned forward, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. "You don't act like a pet," he muttered. Max didn't react at first, but after a beat, he turned his head slightly, those dark eyes locking onto Khalil's. It was unsettling, the depth of understanding in them. Khalil smirked, shaking his head. "You know, they say you're too soft, but I think you're just waiting." Max blinked slowly, then rested his head on his paws again, exhaling through his nose. Khalil leaned back against the couch, tilting his head up. What exactly was he waiting for? The moment stretched between them, quiet and unspoken, until a knock at the door broke the silence. "Sir." Malik's voice carried through the heavy wooden doors. Khalil sighed, setting his glass down. "Come in." Malik stepped inside, his usual composed expression slightly tighter than usual. Khalil immediately caught the shift in his posture. Something was wrong. "What is it?" Malik hesitated before speaking. "We found something on the intruder from last night." Khalil's brow furrowed. "I thought he was just a random thief." Malik shook his head. "So did I. But after digging a little deeper, turns out he wasn't alone." A heavy pause settled between them. Khalil sat up straighter, his mind shifting into strategy mode. "Explain." Malik handed him a folder, the same kind he always used when presenting Khalil with intelligence reports. Inside were surveillance photos, records, and a name circled in red. "The man from last night was just a scout," Malik continued. "Someone was testing your security, seeing how far they could get before they were caught." Khalil's jaw tightened. He had enemies. Many, in fact. Competitors, rivals, people who would love nothing more than to see him vulnerable. But breaking into his home? That was an entirely different level of boldness. "Who sent him?" Khalil asked, flipping through the papers. Malik exhaled. "Still working on that. But sir, if Max hadn't reacted when he did, we wouldn't have caught him until it was too late." At that, Khalil's grip on the folder tightened slightly. His security system, millions of dollars worth of the best technology, hadn't detected the threat in time. His armed guards hadn't sensed it either, but Max had, the so-called failure. Malik glanced at the German Shepherd, who was still lying near the balcony, but now watching them intently, as if he understood the weight of the conversation. "He's not just a dog," Malik said, voice low. "And he's definitely not a mistake." Khalil said nothing. After a moment, Malik spoke again. "I can assign him formal training if you want. Reinforce obedience. Sharpen his instincts even more." Khalil's gaze flicked to Max, who still hadn't looked away. He thought about the reports. About how Max had been rejected because he hesitated, because he made his own choices, because he wasn't a mindless tool. Khalil closed the folder, setting it aside. "No." Malik raised an eyebrow. "Sir?" "I don't want him changed." Khalil's voice was firm. "I don't need another trained soldier. I need him to be exactly who he is." Malik studied him for a moment, then nodded. "Understood." With that, he turned and left, leaving Khalil alone with Max once more. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Then, slowly, Max stood, stretching his legs before making his way over to Khalil's side. He sat down near the couch, his presence steady, unwavering. Khalil sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. "You're really not going anywhere, are you?" Max simply stared. Khalil huffed a quiet laugh, shaking his head. Then, after a moment, he reached out and let his fingers brush against Max's fur for the first time. The German Shepherd didn't flinch, didn't pull away. He just sat there, allowing the touch. And in that simple moment, something shifted. For the first time in years, Khalil felt something he never expected. He wasn't just being protected, he was being trusted. The following morning, Khalil woke up with a strange sense of awareness. It wasn't the usual sharp readiness he had developed after years in business, the instinct to anticipate threats and seize opportunities. No, this was different. It was presence. Something had changed. As he stepped onto the terrace outside his bedroom, coffee in hand, his gaze instinctively swept across the estate grounds. And there he was. Max. The German Shepherd moved with quiet purpose, his eyes scanning the area, his posture controlled but alert. He wasn't restless, wasn't wandering aimlessly. He was watching. Not just for entertainment, not out of curiosity. Max was patrolling. Khalil exhaled slowly, a smirk tugging at the corner of his lips. "You've already decided this place is yours, haven't you?" he muttered to himself. As if hearing him, Max paused, lifting his head slightly, before continuing his rounds. For a dog that had been cast aside as too soft, he certainly carried himself like a protector. A knock at the door pulled Khalil's attention back inside. Malik, as punctual as ever. "Sir," Malik greeted as he stepped into the room, "I've got the latest report." Khalil turned, arching a brow. "On the intruder?" Malik handed him a tablet. "And more." Khalil's gaze flicked over the screen. The data was concise, organized, just how he liked it. It wasn't just about the man who had broken in 2 nights ago. There were more. Similar incidents in different locations, all connected by a common thread. High-profile businessmen targeted for potential breaches. "This isn't random," Khalil murmured. "No," Malik agreed. "Someone's probing, testing security weaknesses, and yours wasn't the first attempt." Khalil clenched his jaw, processing the implications. He was no stranger to power struggles, corporate warfare, hostile takeovers, political maneuvering. But this was personal. Someone was gathering intel, looking for vulnerabilities. And if Max hadn't been there that night... He set the tablet down, rubbing his jaw thoughtfully. "Increase security protocols. I want every inch of this estate covered." Malik nodded. "Already in motion." Then, after a brief pause, he added, "And Max?" Khalil glanced out the window again. The dog had stopped near the gate, ears perked, tail still. Always watching, always calculating, he exhaled. "I'm keeping him close." That afternoon, Khalil took Max for another walk through the estate. It had become a habit over the past few days, one he didn't bother analyzing too deeply. Max moved in sync with him, never straying too far, but never clinging either. The dog had a natural rhythm, adjusting his pace to match Khalil's without needing commands. Halfway through their walk, Khalil decided to test something. He stopped abruptly. Max stopped too. Not a second too late, not a second too early. Just perfect timing. Khalil turned to face him fully. "You really do think for yourself, don't you?" Max tilted his head slightly, his gaze intelligent, unblinking. Khalil let out a slow breath. "Fine. Let's see how far that goes." He turned, walking in the opposite direction. No command, no signal. Just movement. Max followed. A slow smirk crept across Khalil's face. He continued his experiment, changing pace, altering direction, even stopping suddenly again. Each time, Max adapted seamlessly, without hesitation. He wasn't just trained, he was reading him. By the time they reached the estate's outer perimeter, Khalil had seen enough. He crouched slightly, eye level with the dog. "They called you a failure because you hesitated in training." Max's ears twitched, Khalil's gaze softened just slightly. But I don't need a dog that follows orders blindly. Max held his stare, silent but understanding. Khalil exhaled, standing back up. I need one that chooses to follow me. And as they walked back to the estate, side by side, Khalil knew Max had already made his choice. That evening, Khalil found himself watching Max more than he should have. The dog had settled by the grand staircase, his body still, eyes scanning the entrance like a silent guardian. Khalil exhaled, swirling the whiskey in his glass. You act like you own this place, he murmured. Max didn't move, didn't blink. He was waiting. Khalil set his glass down and leaned forward, his elbows on his knees. All right then, tell me something. Why did you hesitate back in training? Silence. Just those steady, intelligent eyes watching him. Khalil let out a small chuckle, shaking his head. You're not going to answer, are you? A beat passed. Then, to his complete surprise, Max huffed. A small breath, almost like amusement. Khalil's smirk faded. Something about that moment hit deeper than it should have. For the first time, he realized Max wasn't just a protector, he understood him. The next morning, Malik approached him with another report. Khalil barely glanced at it. I don't need more paperwork, Malik. Malik hesitated. It's not about the intruder this time. Khalil sighed. Then what? Malik looked over his shoulder. It's about Max. Khalil's brow furrowed. What about him? Malik handed him a separate folder. Khalil flipped it open, scanning the details inside. And the more he read, the deeper his frown became. Max's history. Not just a failed canine, not just a reject. He had disobeyed a direct order to attack. Khalil's grip on the papers tightened. He looked down at Max, who sat near his chair waiting. Always waiting. And for the first time, Khalil wondered, had Max been protecting someone all along? That night, Khalil couldn't shake the thought. He sat on the edge of his bed staring at Max, who lay calmly near the door. The question burned in his mind. What happened before you were rejected? He exhaled slowly. You hesitated in training. Why? Max lifted his head, eyes locked onto his. Another beat of silence. Then, slowly, Max turned away. Deliberate, controlled, refusing to answer. Khalil narrowed his eyes. He wasn't just a dog. He was holding a secret, and Khalil was going to find out what it was.